Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's a Partisan Permaculture primer to give you all an idea of some of the stuff and the depth and breadth of what's happening over in Patreon. We'll talk about Partisan Permaculture preservation. And going on a P theme, right? We're going to talk about a staple that has been used in North America for quite some time. And one of the acronyms the military teaches for setting up systems is survival, right? SURVIVAL. The A equals act like the natives, right? Act like the natives. So one of the things you can do when you're setting up a system in your AO is to find out what has stood the test of time. How are the deer doing it? How is the flora? How is the fauna? What is naturally grows in your area, so you're not fighting against the climate and all those other forces. Most of the non-sustainable agricultural practices that put stuff in boxes and bags, generally speaking, are monocultures of death and are non-sustainable practices when you take that stuff far out without enormous input of energy, right? When you reduce stuff to the individual scale, you have to be way more efficient, whether that is the management of your security to your sustainability. So sustainability, survival applications, weapons systems. I talk about sustain with mums, manufacture, use, right? Maintenance and the sustainable systems. Certain things are easier to sustain than others, right? They're just easier. If you look back to the natives in this country, some of you may be familiar with the Three Sisters way of growing, which is corn, beans, and squash, because they're complementary to each other. They're not in a monoculture, right? It has to do with a lot of things. And do not emote in the comments here. This is not your classroom. This is not your room. This is not your grandstand. This is just some information to give you a taste of the depth and breadth of what is on Patreon, right? So obviously, if you don't want to support me, that's fine. I do not care. Please check out supporting my brother, Taborosaurus Rex. Read our channel description here, and you will understand why I'm doing this. Or go support Brother Bear, and especially Grindstone Ministries. Go over there, help them out. Be respectful in their comment section. All right, don't act like a jerk. All right, don't steal their time. Don't be a communist. All right. So I have been doing this stuff for a long time. I was moving some cases of things downstairs, and we used to live in a very humid climate, and people have asked me for recommendations for rings and lids and brands and all that. Well, brands, I'm not a big brand person, but there's concepts, right? I'm going to show you what happens just with a little bit of humidity with the newer style lids, right? This is pumpkin. Color doesn't really come close on the camera, and people are like, oh, whatever. Well, pumpkin. So we're entering into the fall season where people worship their evil gods in a lot of ways. You will find some of the pagan rituals throughout America, and a lot of those, you will see an uptake in the sale of pumpkin. Pumpkin is basically a squash, right? And it is a staple. A lot of people think of pumpkin, they just think of pumpkin pie. They don't think of pumpkin as a soup. They don't think of pumpkin as a carb-filling, high caloric dense food that it is, especially the seeds, right? So there's a lot of things that it can be used for. It can be used for feeding livestock, blah, 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 blah. No need to go on that. But the conversation here is the advantage and disadvantage of certain storage systems. Standard ball or Kerr canning jar, I think they're made by the same companies now. Wide mouth is what if you're going to standardize on jars, I would standardize on wide mouth, especially when you start getting to canning meat, which I've been doing for a long time. Well over 30 years. This was canned 11 November 2013. You can see the rust on the top. of this lid. You can see the rust, right? The new lids, the coatings are thinner than the older ones. The tin is thinner. They bend easy. They're not durable. They're not a sustainable system. They don't continue to last. You have to buy new lids, right? So, and eventually jars break, right? That'll happen too, especially with newer jars, right? They change their formation of sand or whatever they use, and certain things, they just don't make everything like they used to, right? Some of the older lids, I still have in service, which, you know, they say, oh, they use them once. I've had lids that were passed down to me. They're literally twice as thick when I put a micrometer on them compared to the newer stuff. So the newer stuff, you look, and this is less than a decade, right? Almost coming up on a decade of use, right? With a high humid climate, stored in a relatively temperature stable environment. That happens. When it's very hard to have the cabinet space for the sheer volume of stuff when you're really doing it. So you end up with canning rooms or pantries and things that are, you know, you get cases and cases of things. Now, the problem with this is heavy, right? It's in liquid form, easy, and where I like pumpkin canned stuff of this nature is that because it's pressure canned, this is not hot water bath, it's pressure canned. It gets mushy real quick, which is really easy to feed younglings, like the little ones. Like it only takes a little bit of time with a potato masher to turn this into decent baby food. So if you're looking at sustainable systems with, you know, small kids that don't have all their teeth yet and that kind of thing, it can be a highly nutritious and delicious treat, is pumpkin. And widely available coming up here in the fall after certain holidays that people celebrate, it's easy to get a bunch of pumpkin, right? You can get a lot of it really cheap after, right, October, and especially after November, right? You can get a lot of pumpkin pretty darn cheap, and that's the time to stock up on it. But now there's a couple different ways you could do it. If you pressure can it, I mean, this has lasted, you know, almost 10 years. I've had it last longer, right? You keep it out of sunlight and that kind of thing, right? There's all kinds of methods. This is not about methods of things, but just something to think about. If you switch, this was canned basically a year later, right? October, right? You can see that this lid, right? These plastic lids with a rubber gasket. This one happens to be made by Tatler, right? Which is made in the United States. No rust, right? The only thing that's going to rust is the ring. Well, if you're storing in a place with high humidity, right, you can remove the ring. And so now the only thing here, there's no metal, right? Now, you don't want to transport that way because anything that gets pushed on it, whatever, it could break the seal, etc. But you can store this in like a cabinet, right, without the lid. And so the lids you can reuse and reuse and reuse. And then you don't have metal in the equation. So there is nothing to rust. So if you live near the ocean spray, the salt air, this type of stuff happens rather rapidly. If it's super dry where you live, it doesn't matter, right? A lot of stuff will stay outside in arid environments with minimal rust for decades that wouldn't last one season in the Pacific Northwest rainforest. So, you know, your context is key. I say that time and time again. It absolutely is key. The plastic with the rubber seal, these are reusable, which lends it towards a sustainable system. This one's, you know, canned a year later, basically 11 months from the other one. And if I was worried about the climate deteriorating my lids and rings, I would take the lid or the ring off, right? Another thing I've done in the past is I have used, especially with the rings, because they don't touch really any of the food, I have clear coated the rings, right, to help them. Now, everyone that starts venting about garbage, it's all about keeping stuff sustainable. If you haven't canned on a campfire with a pressure cooker, you may not have traversed this world as much as I have. if you don't regularly drink out of a canning jar, you may not have traversed this as much as I have. So here we have basically the amount of 3 of these, but it's dried instead. This was done the same time as this was, well, as basically a month later than this. This has been nothing but stored with hot air, right, and a normal seal. Now, does that leak, blah, blah, blah? Yeah, but if it's inside. Now, can you use the vacuum seal and do that? Yes, you can. That's a step. You can put a couple grains of salt in it. You can put a oxygen absorber, right? There's all kinds of ways, and this isn't about you to tout all the different ways you do all the stuff. I'm pointing out a principle. Act like the natives. A squash is how they met a lot of their caloric intake, right? So is meat, so is fats, right? So is seeds, so is fruits, so is berries, right? Those things were highly dense, right? This type of thing would store in rawhide pouches. So there's this thing called the rule of enough that I learned from one of my mentors. Close enough, fair enough, accurate enough. That's from Ron Hood, from Hood's Woods. I agree. The dry space container, whatever that may be, 5-gallon bucket, Ziploc bag, right, is a technological wonder. It does all kinds of things for you that you're hard-pressed to do it with rawhide pouches. If you look at the way things were sealed in the past with crocks, with submersion, with glassing eggs to coating stuff in lard to keep oxygen out, melting fat over, etc. Like I've ran mums out when it comes to food preservation primitively as well as using modern gear. Now, if you've got $2 to $4 grand laying around and you want to get a freeze dryer, rock on, man. That's awesome. I think those are great. People here that have those, and they're great. But it's been they weren't available. In 2014, there was no easily obtainable freeze drying option for the homesteader. They were just too damn unobtainium with the expense. And even now, they're pretty darn expensive. So stuff like this, now I've got basically 3 quarts worth, right, in 1 quart. Takes up less space. It's a shit ton lighter. So dried food has stood the test of time, from raisins that goes back to the Pharaoh's days. So if you think about act like the natives, the food preservation technique that is the most accessible, that is the gateway drug for food preservation, is dehydration. Whether that's jerky or pumpkin or hanging it up on a clothesline in the bright sun, there's all kinds of ways to do it, and it is very accessible for most people if they just have dry space. Because now that we have screens and easy to obtain line and hooks and electric dehydrators and solar dehydrator plans and plywood and all the cool stuff, right? It makes that even easier. And you throw something as simple as glass and plastic, which this doesn't have the other seal. You can't put wax paper when you screw it down to give it a seal, act like an O-ring. People transport milk that way up here. And so that if you were worried about that, or you can use the vacuum seal pump and do it. This has not, because this is something I throw into soups here and there. It is perfectly fine. This has been stored this way. This, trust me, this is way more advanced than any rawhide container of the day. Right, way more. This is a technological advancement, food preservation to protect your food from rodents. So things go in cycles with the harvest season. You may not see as many jars available come dead of winter. So what am I saying is get stuff while it's available now. Get your lids that are sustainable. Get your jars that you can. Learn how to dry stuff is a good way to start because it takes the least amount of expense. And it has to be one of the more portable skill sets that you can take with you in the high mountains if you have the technology to make even fire or a shelter over your head. Drying things from mushrooms to meat and everything in between, it can save you. It is literally a life-saving skill if you understand how to do it, that has been employed by the ancients from the centuries. And when we look at partisan permaculture, the preservation perspective is huge, right? But that preservation perspective has to also look at it as a sustainable system when the power's out. Do all the freeze drying you can when the power's up. Do all the electric dehydration when you can when the power's up. Right? I can use these with a sheet of metal and coals in my pressure canners on a wood fire. Right? I can dry on a wood fire. So if I was going to pick one food preservation technique that helps you traverse the world, that gives you a good preservation skill, it would be to dry stuff, because that's how you can create very lightweight combat rations for your pack. That's how you can have sustainable systems, whether you're foraging, doing the hunter-gatherer, or the agrarian approach to survival. Both have been successful throughout the ages. But they both had something in common, and that was drying food of all sorts. Everything from just a concrete pad out in the jungle being the rice dryer, right? Drying food is the number one preservation technique that I would start learning and I would master, because it is the most portable with the least amount of equipment, is drying food. I have dried food and kept it in something as simple as a Ziploc bag, and it's lasted years and years. So you can start to see why, when I look at sustainable systems, are there stuff that is better, that carries more nutrients, that causes longer shelf life, etc.? Yes, absolutely, and use those while you can. Just like you can use super accurate rifles for super niche 90%. What's your 90% going to be like? What's your 90% if you're a refugee? What type of skills can you bring to the table with some twine and some dead airspace and some heat, and understanding how to preserve food? Because this method, the drying method, is superior, right, to anything as far as portable skills for food preservation. That's not equipment dependent. In the bush in Africa, they would dry meat literally on bushes. They cut up in thin strips, and the hot sun would do the work for them. Now, hard to do in the Pacific Northwest where the sun doesn't shine, right? But you need dry airspace to keep yourself alive. So you can task stack by drying. I do most of my canning and my drying when I'm running the wood stove, because it's just easier. Or the drying when it's summer, because it's less mechanical input for me, right? Less energy expended. So the pumpkin, that is, think of the calories, do the math yourself, like pumpkins versus tomatoes or other things. And when I say pumpkin, it can be pumpkin or squash, right? A lot of places in North America, you can grow those things relatively easy. There's a lot of high dense and carbohydrate food that has high caloric value. Once an apple tree is planted and sustained, and to a certain size where the threats of the deer and the elk and the bears not breaking it, dried apples can be a staple. They can be a staple, and they can solve a lot of caloric intake problems in the long term. So get out into the high mountains if you can. Come over to Patreon if you want to visit. Learn some of the stuff of Partisan Permaculture, learn some of the stuff of the systems that Survival Applications Weapon Systems provides. Don't come over if you're a know-it-all. Don't come over if you want to tout your brand and all that crap. I'm not going to put up with it. If you want to learn something, come over. If not, go visit Bear Independent here on YouTube. Go visit my brother Rex here on YouTube. Right, you'll find the links in the description. And support Grindstone Ministries if you get a chance, and Refuge Medical. Get outside to the high mountains if you can. Carry rucksacks, not feelings bags. Shalom.